look who's turned up. He quit his job as immigration minister in December after the government failed to get migrant flights to Rwanda off the ground.
Now, Robert Jenrick is back with a brand-new plan to tackle legal migration with 30 recommendations for Rishi Sunak to take back control.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Let's just do that question now. Why are we having to release people from prisons early? You know, you're still a Conservative MP, you're still part of the governing party. You were in the Home Office. I mean, is that what we really have got to?
Well, we haven't built enough prison places, is the problem. We committed to do that some time ago, and some have been added, but not enough. And in fact, I want to see more prolific offenders go to jail, because there's a small number of hyper-prolific offenders who are committing a very large proportion of the crimes in this country. But to do that, you've got to do a big prison-building programme, and we've just been too slow at that as a country. Part of that is our scholastic planning system that's meant that it's proved to be very slow to build all these new prisons that were committed to some time ago. That has to be a big priority for government.
But I'm always interested with former ministers, and you're here to talk about immigration because you've just done a big 30-point report on it. Is those of us who are outside of politics, you're here to say all the things that should have been done in a 30-point plan, but you were immigration minister. If you think this was right, why haven't you done this already? You've been in government for, well over a decade. You were an immigration minister. Why are you only now coming up with a 30-point plan?
Well, in fairness, Martin, I resigned as immigration minister because I felt that I'd gone as far as I could within government. Well, it was over both, actually. It was over both. I worked very hard within government, behind the scenes, to try to persuade the government to tackle legal migration. And as a result of the conversations I had with the Prime Minister, we did do a big intervention, you might remember, in December last year, where the Prime Minister agreed to a set of measures that will reduce the number of people coming into this country legally by about 300,000. But to me, that was a first step, not the end. I want to see us go much further than that. And I concluded that the will wasn't there within government to do it at the time. And so I left the government, which is quite an unusual thing to do because I felt so strongly about it. Outside of government, I've tried to make the argument both to take further steps on illegal migration. You might remember that I tried to amend the Rwanda bill as it was passing through Parliament, which would have made it significantly stronger, got rid of some of the loopholes, which I think will be exploited in the weeks ahead.
Can I just press
and I'd like to go further now on legal migration.
Yeah, can I press the point that Martin made to you, which is you are much more powerful within government than you are as a voice outside of government. Under a Conservative government, a Prime Minister, David Cameron, said he would keep immigration in the tens of thousands. I mean, we reached 750,000 legal migrants in this country. You've been part of that government. What went wrong?
Well, I don't think it's just actually this government. I think for the last 30 years, politicians of all stripes have essentially misled the public. They've made promises on immigration and failed to keep them.
That record level of legal migration, some people might think it's a good thing because, of course, immigrants bring enormous value to the economy. But you are arguing that it's too high. That happened on your watch, on the Conservative government's watch. It's all very well to go back 30 years. This is 14 years that the Conservatives have been in government, and we have record levels of legal migration. You've now resigned from the government and expect to have a powerful voice, noises off, complaining about it.
Well, first, I'm not just complaining about it. I'm actually putting forward a fully worked-through plan which could actually fix this problem and get us back to the tens of thousands.
Outside of government, though?
Well, sometimes you have to do that, don't you? If you believe in something, why are you in politics but to stand up for your principles? And I ultimately didn't believe that the government was going in the right direction on this issue. But to your question, I do think that the government has made some serious errors after we left the European Union, because the first time in my lifetime we actually took back control of the levers of migration. We ended free movement, and that meant that politicians had much more control than they'd ever had in the past. But they did make some serious mistakes, and that, to me, was a betrayal of Brexit. What we've got to do now is fix it. And we still have time within this Parliament to make the changes that I'm proposing, which would ensure that we get back down to the tens of thousands.
It's interesting. You mentioned, ending freedom of movement. In your report, you're talking about you actually going to some quite potentially controversial stuff about how immigrants from Spain and from Western democracies earn more than from immigrants from elsewhere in the world. Well, it was freedom of movement that brought those people into the country. So do you regret ending freedom of movement? If you want higher earning migrants coming in, we closed that door, didn't we, to an extent?
I don't regret that. I think actually Brexit has been borne out in respect of immigration because we have the ability to control...
Because we're at record immigration,
we have the ability to control our borders in a way you simply didn't in the past. So when David Cameron and Theresa May made pledges to reduce the number of migrants coming into the country, they simply weren't able to fulfil those because for a very large proportion of the world, we were subject to freedom of movement. What I want to do is essentially now instill the same kind of highly selective, controlled migration system for the whole world, which we haven't done in the recent past. But you are right to say, and the report sets this out, that there are big differences in the contribution that different migrants are making from different parts of the world. I think that's very difficult to select migrants by nationality, so we're not proposing that. But what we are saying is we want a much more selective system per se. Okay. And so we want the UK to be the grammar school of the world. We choose people to come here who will be net contributors to the economy, not cost expense.
One of the interesting things about immigration is when you talk to people and when they poll people about immigration in its entirety, people say they want less immigration. But when you ask about specific sectors, do we want less care workers? Do we want less doctors? People then tend to have a different view. Now, you are proposing capping the number of care workers to 30,000 when we currently have 150,000 vacancies in the care sector and a crisis in care. I mean, you might bring immigration down, but wouldn't you bring the care service down at the same time?
I don't think so. But you are right to say that there are trade-offs in anything that you do in this area.
So the maths doesn't add up to me, so how would it work?
Well, with social care, what we're proposing is simply returning to the situation that we were 2 years ago, so not very long ago, and 30,000 would still be 5 times more than when this particular visa was introduced by the Home Office and the Department for Health. What we've seen when we've brought in a very large number of care workers from overseas is not the number of vacancies fall, but the displacement of British workers who've generally left the sector and gone to do other things. And the argument that we're making...
But if there's all those vacancies, how would you displace people who are already doing the job?
The argument that we're making is that it would be better to pay British workers a little bit more to look after British people in care homes and in hospitals than to import foreign people from overseas.
So a public sector pay rise?
Well, it would require more money, but...
You know that every time the government says that they can't pay people more, they say because it's inflationary.
Well, we think that this would actually save the taxpayer money in the long term because it's a false economy to be bringing in somebody from overseas to do that job with all of the extra costs that come with that person, because people don't come to this country with a mile of road, a hospital bed, a house. All of that stock of infrastructure has to be added to the country every time you bring somebody in.
£42 billion, it's estimated, is brought in by international students. It's one of our biggest export earners in the country. It's also completely is the only way that universities can afford to educate UK undergraduates because of the subsidy from people coming in overseas because of the cap on tuition fees and the lack of government money going forward. But you want to stop graduate visas as well. So you're looking to basically cut back one of our biggest export earners. So as well as no care staff, we want to sort of put things around the ankles of our universities at the same time?
No, and I don't think those facts are quite right. There's a recent study, for example, in the last few days that claims that international students bring in about £70 million a year to the Exchequer, which isn't actually a huge amount of money.
It's totally
when you balance that against all of... I think that's by Oxford Economics. But if you balance that against all of the other costs... I mean, for example, last year, 5,000 international students who came here claimed asylum. A recent study by the University of Amsterdam said that every asylum seeker costs a country around €500,000 over their lifetime. So those 5,000 students who claimed asylum are likely to cost the UK about 2.3 billion
If we have
euros.
less overseas students, do you think you'd have to increase the revenue to universities to make up for it?
Not necessarily. Firstly, rather like with social care workers, you're only talking about taking the UK back to the position it was in 2 years ago. And secondly, I don't think that universities in the UK should be focused almost exclusively, as some are today, on international students. I want them to be much more focused on domestic students.
You would lift the tuition fee cap, because currently the tuition fees that go to many universities isn't enough to fund the cost of education for undergraduates. So would you lift the tuition fee cap?
No, I wouldn't, but I don't.
So you're going to deny them overseas earnings?
The case.
So how are universities going to survive? They're already financially struggling.
Well, I think there's a misperception by some commentators about the types of students who've come in over the course of the last year or two. The majority have actually been students coming in on short courses, not always of the highest quality, and rarely at the highest quality institutions. Russell Group institutions, for example, only accounted for around a quarter of the increase in international students. And many of these universities simply got into the immigration business rather than the education business. They're selling courses as a backdoor to life in the UK. And I think that's wrong and the wrong priority for those universities.
Before we let you go, Kevin, Andrew.
Well, I welcome Comrade Jenrick, Brother Bob's conversion to higher pay for low-paid care workers. But you said politicians had misled people. Why should anybody believe you when you stood as an MP for Newark, you've been a minister, manifestos, you've made promises, you have just not kept? Why should anybody believe you now?
Well, I sympathise with the anger and frustration that many people feel in the country. I think you have to accept that. All you can do now, or we can do now as a party, is to make changes that begin to restore credibility. And what I've set out in this report with another Member of Parliament, Neil O'Brien, is a set of measures that could be done before summer recess this year, which would bring the system back under control.
It's quite something, isn't it?
At the heart of my report, if I can answer you directly, is a capped system whereby Parliament actually votes on a cap. And that is a binding democratic...
You stood and said the figure would be below 100,000. It never was. Why should anyone believe you now?
To stay in the tens of thousands.
Now we've left the European Union, we actually have control of the levers.
Yeah, but you still haven't done it.
So many times.
In fairness, Martin, not previously, because we weren't able to control our borders previously because we weren't outside the European Union.
When you were immigration minister, that was after Brexit. You were immigration minister. You're telling me we left the European Union, we can control our levers. You were immigration minister. Immigration went up. Why do we believe you now?
Well,
what's different now? Because you don't have the levers of power.
Well, my personal record was instituting the biggest reduction in net migration of all time. I persuaded the Prime Minister to put in place measures that will reduce the number of people coming to this country by 300,000. But I wasn't able to persuade him to do as much as I wanted. Therefore, I resigned. And I think there's not many people who resign from cabinet.
There we must leave it. Robert Jenrick, we really appreciate you coming in this morning. Thank you very much indeed. Final word, Andy?
No. Fine.
Fine.
I'm with him. I want him to cut immigration.
Don't you think it's remarkable?
Well, you've misled people as well.
No, it's too high.
You've both misled people.
It's far too high. It's far too high, and the Prime Minister's listening.
You both misled people. No.
Would you pay care workers more?
Yes, I would. I've said that before.
I think
would you stop overseas care workers coming in?
Well, you can't, because we need them.
Well, he says you can.
Well,
so you're not with him?
I'm with him a lot of the way.
Right.
That was a quick split.
Yeah. It's all fun and games until you get into the details, isn't it? Andrew, Kevin, thank you very much indeed. Robert Jenrick, thank you.